The town was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. People walked the same streets every day, greeted the same neighbors, and visited the same shops. Life moved slowly there, and very few surprises ever happened. But sometimes, even in the calmest places, something unexpected was quietly waiting to unfold. Near the center of the town stood a small cafe on a narrow street corner. It was not a fancy place, but it was warm and welcoming. The smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the air every morning. Many people stopped by before work, while others visited in the afternoon to relax and talk. A young woman worked there almost every day. She arrived early in the morning before most people were awake. The first thing she did was sweep the floor and wipe the tables. After that, she helped prepare the coffee and arranged the cups neatly along the counter. Her life was simple and quiet. She did not talk much, but she was always polite to everyone. Customers often noticed how calm she seemed. Even when the cafe was busy, she worked patiently without complaining. What many people did not know was that she had a deep love for music. Just across the street from the cafe stood an old building that looked slightly more elegant than the others. Large windows faced the road, and in the evenings soft music often floated out into the street. It was a music hall where students practiced and musicians gathered for small performances. Every day, when the young woman finished serving customers, she would sometimes pause for a moment near the door of the cafe. If the windows across the street were open, she could hear the sound of a piano being played. The sound always caught her attention. Sometimes the music was cheerful and bright. Other times it was slow and emotional. She never rushed away when she heard it. Instead, she quietly stood there for a few moments, listening carefully as if each note carried a secret message. Music had always meant something special to her. When she was younger, she had once seen a piano in a community building in another town. She remembered standing near it, staring at the black and white keys with curiosity. She had gently touched one key and heard the soft sound it made. That single note had stayed in her memory for years. But life had not given her many chances to learn music. Her family had struggled financially when she was growing up. Buying instruments or paying for lessons was simply not possible. As a result, her dream of playing the piano had remained only a quiet wish. Even so, she never lost her love for the sound. Over time, she began learning in her own small way. Whenever she heard music, she paid close attention to it. She noticed how melodies changed, how some notes felt soft while others sounded powerful. Without realizing it, she slowly developed a strong sense for music just by listening. At home, she had an old keyboard that someone had once thrown away. A neighbor had found it and offered it to her, saying it might still work. Several keys were damaged, and the sound was not perfect, but to her it felt like a treasure. Every evening after work, she sat beside the small keyboard and practiced quietly. Her fingers were not trained like those of professional musicians, but she had patience. She listened carefully and tried to repeat melodies she had heard earlier in the day. Sometimes she made mistakes. Sometimes the sound was not quite right, but she kept trying again and again. Little by little, her hands became more confident. Still, almost nobody in town knew about this part of her life. To most people, she was simply the quiet cafe worker who served coffee and cleaned tables. One afternoon, something unusual happened in the music hall across the street. Several well-known musicians had arrived in town for a small private gathering. Word quickly spread among people who loved music. By evening, the building was filled with guests. Soft lights glowed through the tall windows, and the sound of conversations floated out into the street. Inside, musicians discussed music, instruments, and performances. Some of them were highly skilled players who had studied for many years. The young woman noticed the activity while working at the cafe. Customers were excited about the gathering and talked about it while drinking coffee. Some of them mentioned that a beautiful grand piano had been placed in the center of the hall for the evening. When she heard this, a quiet curiosity filled her mind. Later that evening, the cafe owner asked her to take a tray of refreshments to the building across the street. The guests had ordered drinks and snacks for the gathering. She carefully placed cups and plates onto the tray and walked toward the music hall. As she stepped inside, She immediately noticed the difference between this place and the simple cafe. The room was spacious and bright. Elegant lights hung from the ceiling, and chairs were arranged around a large open space. But the most beautiful object in the room stood right in the center. A grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the warm lights above. The lid was slightly open, revealing the strings inside. The black and white keys looked perfectly smooth and untouched. For a moment she simply stood there, holding the tray, unable to look away. There was something about the instrument that felt almost magical to her. Several guests were talking nearby, laughing and sharing stories about music performances. Some of them wore elegant clothing, and their confident voices filled the room. Compared to them, she felt very small and ordinary. She quietly placed the refreshments on a nearby table and tried not to draw attention to herself. Still, her eyes occasionally moved back toward the piano. One of the musicians soon walked toward the instrument and began playing a short melody. The notes flowed beautifully through the room, and conversations slowly softened as people listened. The young woman felt her heart beat a little faster. Standing there, she remembered all the evenings she had spent practicing at home on the old keyboard. She remembered the broken keys and the quiet determination she felt each time she tried to learn something new. But this piano was completely different. It was perfect. She wondered for a brief moment what it might feel like to play even a single note on such an instrument. The thought felt almost impossible. After all, she was not a trained musician. She had never studied in a school like the others in this room. To them, she was probably just someone delivering drinks. So she stayed silent and continued helping quietly. Yet something inside her kept pulling her attention back toward the piano. Across the room, a group of guests had begun joking with one another. They were discussing different piano pieces and laughing about difficult performances they had experienced. One person joked that anyone in the room should try playing a piece for fun. The comment made several people laugh. Some guests encouraged others to try the piano, but most of them waved their hands and refused, saying they were not ready to perform in front of so many skilled musicians. The mood in the room became light and playful. The young woman watched quietly from a distance. At that moment, she had no idea that the simple joke echoing through the room would soon lead to something no one there would ever forget. Because in only a short time, the same room filled with laughter would fall completely silent. And the reason for that silence would surprise everyone. The room inside the music hall felt warm and lively. Conversations moved from one corner to another as people talked about music, performances, and the long journeys they had taken to learn their craft. Laughter rose and faded again as stories were shared. The grand piano in the center of the room remained the quiet star of the evening. The young woman who had come from the cafe stood near the refreshment table. She tried to stay out of the way while guests picked up their drinks. Her work was simple. She made sure the cups were filled, the plates were arranged neatly, and nothing was missing. But even while working, she could not help looking at the piano. It seemed to pull her attention again and again. One musician finished playing a short piece and stood up from the bench while people clapped politely. Another guest walked closer to the piano and ran a finger lightly across a few keys, creating a playful sound that made a few people smile. The mood in the room was relaxed now. The formal conversations had turned into friendly teasing and light jokes. Musicians often did this when they gathered together. After talking seriously about music, they enjoyed laughing with one another. At one point, a tall man near the piano lifted his glass and joked loudly, saying that the instrument had been sitting too quietly for too long. "Well," he said with a playful grin, "if anyone here is brave enough, they should come and play something." A few people laughed immediately. Another guest replied that everyone in the room was probably too afraid to embarrass themselves in front of such talented musicians. More laughter followed. Someone suggested that even a simple melody would be entertaining. Soon the joking grew louder. One musician tapped the side of the piano and said the instrument did not care who played it. According to him, even a beginner could make music if they had courage. People began pointing at each other, encouraging someone to try. But each person simply laughed and stepped back, pretending they were too shy. The young woman watched quietly from the refreshment table. She had no intention of getting involved. She knew very well that this gathering was not meant for someone like her. Still, the conversation about playing the piano made her heart beat a little faster. Another round of laughter filled the room when someone joked that perhaps the next person to walk through the door should be the one who played the piano. At that moment, someone happened to glance toward the refreshment table. Their eyes landed on the young woman. She had just finished placing a plate of pastries on the table and was about to step away. The person who noticed her pointed casually and said with a half-smile, "Maybe she should try." The comment was meant as a joke, and several guests turned to look. For a brief moment, the room grew quiet as people noticed her standing there. Some guests chuckled softly. Others looked amused by the idea. One man laughed and said that if she played the piano, it would certainly be the most surprising performance of the evening. A few people nodded playfully, clearly expecting nothing serious. The young woman felt a warm rush of embarrassment rise to her face. She quickly shook her head and said softly that she was only there to deliver refreshments. But the teasing had already started. Another guest said kindly but jokingly that everyone should have the chance to try once. After all, the evening was meant to be fun. Someone else added that the piano keys would not break if a cafe worker touched them. More laughter followed. The words were not cruel, but they carried a quiet sense of mockery. Most of the people speaking did not even realize how their comments sounded. To them, it was just a light moment. To her, it felt different. She lowered her eyes and tried to focus on arranging the cups on the tray. She hoped the conversation would move on to something else soon. But the guests continued smiling and watching her. One person said that if she played even a few notes, they would applaud her bravery. Another jokingly promised to give her a free music lesson afterward. A few people clapped their hands playfully, encouraging her to step forward. The young woman stood still for a moment. Inside her mind, many thoughts rushed through at once. Part of her wanted to quietly leave the room and return to the cafe. That would be the easiest thing to do. But another part of her remembered the evenings she had spent practicing alone at home. She remembered the old keyboard with broken keys. She remembered repeating simple melodies again and again until they sounded right. No one had ever heard her play before. No one had ever asked her to try. Now, suddenly, a whole room of strangers was looking at her. Their smiles suggested they were expecting something funny, perhaps even a quick failure. The idea made her nervous, yet something else stirred quietly inside her. A feeling she could not easily explain. Perhaps it was the memory of how much she loved music. Perhaps it was the way the grand piano stood silently in the center of the room, almost inviting someone to sit down. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that moments like this did not come often in life. The teasing voices around her slowly faded into the background as she thought about it. Then she took a slow breath. The room grew quieter as people waited to see what she would do. Some guests leaned against chairs with curious smiles. Others crossed their arms, still amused by the situation. One person whispered to another that the evening had just become more interesting. The young woman finally looked up. Her eyes moved toward the piano. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Then, very gently, she stepped away from the refreshment table. A few people exchanged surprised glances as they realized she was actually walking toward the instrument. Soft laughter spread again, but now it carried a hint of curiosity. The sound of her footsteps was quiet against the polished floor as she moved across the room. The grand piano seemed even larger as she approached it. Up close, the keys looked smooth and perfect, reflecting the warm lights above. She paused beside the bench. The room had grown strangely silent now. Some guests watched with amused smiles, while others looked slightly puzzled. Perhaps they had not expected her to take the suggestion seriously. The young woman slowly sat down on the piano bench. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment. From the corner of the room, someone whispered that this might be the shortest performance in history. A few quiet chuckles followed, but she did not respond. Instead, she looked at the keys. Her fingers moved slightly, as if remembering something. Then she gently placed her hands above the keyboard. At that moment, no one in the room truly believed anything remarkable was about to happen. To them, this was simply a playful moment. just a cafe worker touching a piano for fun. But in the next few seconds, something unexpected was about to begin. Because the first note she played would change the entire mood of the room. And the laughter that had filled the hall only moments earlier would soon disappear completely. For a few seconds after she placed her hands above the keys, nothing happened. The room stayed quiet, but not in the same way as before. Earlier the silence had been filled with curiosity and playful laughter. Now it carried a strange feeling of waiting. Several guests leaned back in their chairs, still smiling as if they expected a quick mistake or a few random notes. Someone near the wall folded their arms and whispered that this might be entertaining. Another guest quietly said that even if she pressed just one key, they should still clap for her courage. But the young woman sitting at the piano did not seem to hear any of those comments. Her eyes were resting gently on the keys in front of her. Up close, the instrument looked even more beautiful than it had from across the room. The smooth black surface reflected the warm lights above, and the keys felt cool under her fingers. For a moment, memories quietly filled her mind. She remembered the small room where she lived. She remembered the old keyboard placed against the wall. Several keys on that keyboard did not work anymore. Some made weak sounds and others stuck when pressed. Still, she had practiced on it for hours night after night. Sometimes she practiced so quietly that even the neighbors would not hear. Other evenings she repeated the same melody again and again until her fingers finally learned the right movement. There had been many nights when she wondered if those hours meant anything. No one had ever heard her play. No one had ever asked her to perform. And yet, she had continued practicing simply because music made her feel calm and alive. Now she was sitting in front of a real grand piano for the first time in her life. The thought alone made her heart beat a little faster. She took a slow breath and gently closed her eyes for a moment. Across the room, a few people exchanged amused glances. Someone whispered that she might be praying for luck. Another person quietly chuckled. But the laughter faded quickly when something unexpected happened. Her fingers slowly pressed the first key. A single note filled the room. The sound was soft but clear. It echoed gently through the hall and faded into silence. The note was simple, yet it carried a quiet beauty that caught the attention of several guests. The young woman paused for a brief moment, listening to the sound as it faded away. Then she pressed another key, and then another. At first the melody was slow and delicate. Each note followed the one before it carefully, like soft footsteps on a quiet path. The room remained calm, but the playful whispers had stopped. People were listening now. One guest who had been leaning casually against a chair straightened slightly. Another guest who had been holding a drink lowered the glass slowly. The melody continued. Her hands moved gently across the keyboard. The notes were not random at all. They formed a clear pattern. A simple but beautiful tune that felt familiar in a comforting way. A few of the musicians in the room exchanged curious looks. They could tell immediately that this was not the playing of someone who had never touched a piano before. The rhythm was steady. The touch was careful. Each note seemed placed with thought and feeling. The young woman was still sitting calmly at the bench, her posture relaxed but focused. Her eyes remained on the keys, and her fingers moved with quiet confidence. The melody slowly began to grow. What started as a soft tune began to expand, adding more notes and deeper tones. Her left hand joined the right, creating a fuller sound. The music began to fill the room in a way that no one had expected. The guests who had been smiling earlier were no longer laughing. Instead, their expressions slowly changed from amusement to surprise. One musician leaned closer to another and whispered something quietly. Another guest tilted their head slightly, clearly trying to understand what they were hearing. The young woman continued playing without looking at the audience. Her fingers moved more freely now. The melody flowed smoothly, rising and falling with gentle emotion. It was not rushed and it was not forced. The music felt natural, like a story slowly unfolding. A few moments later, the piece grew more complex. Her hands moved across the keys with greater speed, yet the notes remained clear and controlled. Now the sound of the piano carried energy as well as beauty. Someone near the back of the room placed their drink down without realizing it. Another guest quietly pulled a chair closer. The entire atmosphere of the hall had changed. Only minutes earlier the room had been filled with light jokes and laughter. Now the only sound anyone could hear was the music. Even the musicians present in the room seemed deeply focused. They could see the way her fingers moved. They could hear the way she shaped each phrase. There was feeling in her playing. Real feeling. It was the kind of playing that did not come from simply reading notes on a page. It came from hours of listening, practicing, and loving the sound itself. As the music continued, the young woman's confidence seemed to grow with it. Her hands moved faster now, gliding smoothly across the keyboard. The melody shifted into a stronger section, where the notes rose with powerful emotion before falling again into softer moments. The piano seemed almost alive under her fingers. Several guests were now sitting completely still, watching her. One musician who had been joking earlier slowly shook his head in disbelief. Another person leaned forward with wide eyes. No one whispered anymore. No one laughed. The room had become completely silent except for the music. The young woman's expression remained calm, but inside she felt something she had never experienced before. For the first time, she was not playing alone. For the first time, people were listening. And strangely, the presence of the audience did not make her nervous anymore. Instead, it gave her energy. The melody continued building. Her hands moved in graceful patterns across the keyboard, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes bright and lively. The piece she was playing carried a mix of emotions. There were moments that felt peaceful, almost like a quiet walk at sunset. Then suddenly the music would rise again with excitement, like a burst of sunlight breaking through clouds. Each change kept the listeners completely engaged. One guest who had laughed the loudest earlier now sat with his hands folded, watching carefully. Another musician quietly whispered that her technique was far better than they had expected. A few people simply stared at the piano, almost forgetting to breathe. Time seemed to slow down as the performance continued. And with every new phrase of music, one thing became clearer. The young woman sitting at the piano was not just someone who had decided to try a few notes for fun. She was someone who truly understood the instrument. She was someone who had spent countless quiet hours learning its language. And the most surprising part was that no one in the room had seen it coming. Not even for a second. The melody continued to rise toward something bigger. Her fingers moved faster, the notes flowing together with growing power. And in that moment, everyone in the hall realized that what they were hearing was only the beginning. Because the performance that had started with a single quiet note was about to become something unforgettable. The music continued to grow inside the hall, and the change in the room was impossible to ignore now. What had started as a light moment filled with laughter had turned into something completely different. The sound of the piano was no longer just a simple melody. It had become deeper, richer, and full of feeling. The young woman's fingers moved smoothly across the keys. Her hands seemed relaxed, yet every movement was careful and precise. Each note flowed naturally into the next, like a quiet story unfolding without any rush. The guests who had been smiling earlier were now watching closely. Some of them had moved their chairs a little closer without even realizing it. Others stood still with their arms lowered, their attention fixed on the piano. One of the musicians near the wall slowly shook his head in disbelief. He had spent many years studying music, practicing difficult pieces, and performing in different places. Yet the playing he was hearing now carried something special. It was not only about technique. There was emotion inside the music. Felt honest. The young woman did not look up from the piano. Her focus remained on the keys in front of her, but her expression had changed slightly. The nervousness she had felt earlier had slowly disappeared. In its place, there was calm confidence. The melody moved into a stronger section now. Her left hand created a steady rhythm, while her right hand danced lightly over the higher keys. The sound filled every corner of the hall. One guest quietly whispered that the music felt like a conversation. Another person nodded without taking their eyes off the performer. A moment later, the piece shifted again. The music softened suddenly, becoming gentle and peaceful. The room felt almost still as the quieter notes floated through the air. It reminded some listeners of a calm evening after a long day. The young woman's fingers slowed slightly, allowing each note to breathe. She seemed to understand exactly how long each sound should last before the next one began. The balance was perfect. Even the musicians present in the room could feel it. They exchanged quiet glances, recognizing that what they were hearing was not something ordinary. One person who had laughed earlier now stood with his hands resting on the back of a chair. His expression had completely changed. Instead of amusement, there was now respect in his eyes. Another guest leaned forward with curiosity. It was difficult to believe that the person playing this beautiful music was the same quiet cafe worker who had walked into the room carrying a tray of drinks only minutes earlier. The melody began to rise again. Her fingers moved faster now, traveling across the keyboard with smooth confidence. The rhythm became brighter and more energetic. The piano responded beautifully. Each note rang clearly through the hall, and the sound grew stronger as the music built toward another powerful moment. A few guests felt a small shiver of excitement. This part of the music felt alive. The young woman's hands moved with graceful control, her fingers lifting and falling with perfect timing. It looked effortless, yet anyone who understood music could see how much skill it required. One musician quietly muttered that she had remarkable control over the instrument. Another person whispered that her sense of timing was excellent. But the most surprising thing was not just how well she played. It was how naturally the music flowed from her. She did not appear to be trying to impress anyone. She was simply playing. And somehow that made the performance even more powerful. As the music continued, the piece entered a new section filled with deeper emotion. The melody slowed again, but this time it carried a stronger feeling, almost like a memory being shared. Some listeners felt a quiet heaviness in their chest as they listened. The notes were soft, but they held meaning. The young woman's eyes remained focused on the keys. Her shoulders were relaxed, and her breathing matched the rhythm of the music. For a moment it seemed as if she had forgotten the room full of people around her. She was simply lost in the sound. Outside the tall windows of the hall, the night had grown darker. The street lights had begun to glow softly, but inside the room the warm lighting and the music created a calm atmosphere. Time seemed to move slowly. No one checked their phone. No one spoke. The music held everyone's attention. Then the melody began to rise once again. Her hands moved with greater speed now, traveling from one end of the keyboard to the other. The sound of the piano became bold and full of life. The piece had reached one of its most exciting moments. Several guests exchanged surprised looks as the tempo increased. They could see how quickly her fingers were moving, yet every note remained clear. There were no mistakes. The rhythm stayed steady, and the melody continued to shine through the powerful sound. One guest near the front whispered quietly that she played like someone who had been performing for years. Another person nodded slowly. They were beginning to realize that the quiet young woman sitting at the piano carried far more experience than anyone had imagined. The music surged forward with energy, filling the room with bright, lively sound. Then suddenly, just as quickly as it had risen, the melody softened again. Her hands slowed. The powerful notes faded into a gentle, peaceful rhythm. The change was so smooth that it felt natural, like a wave slowly returning to the shore after crashing against the rocks. The guests remained completely silent. A few people sat back in their chairs, letting the softer sound wash over them. The young woman's fingers moved delicately across the higher keys now, creating a light melody that floated through the air like a quiet whisper. It was beautiful in a different way, less dramatic, but deeply touching. The music seemed to speak directly to the listeners. And as the melody continued, something became clear to everyone in the room. This performance was no accident. It was not luck. It was the result of countless quiet hours, endless patience, and a deep love for music. The young woman sitting at the piano had never stood on a stage before. She had never played in front of an audience like this. But none of that mattered now, because in this moment she belonged there. Her hands moved gently across the keyboard as the piece approached another turning point. The melody began to grow once more, slowly building towards something even greater. The listeners could feel it coming. They leaned forward slightly, their attention completely captured. What had started as a small moment of teasing had turned into a performance no one expected. And the most remarkable part was that the music had not reached its final peak yet. Something even more powerful was still waiting to come. The music continued to rise through the hall, filling every corner of the room with energy and emotion. By now, no one remembered the laughter that had started earlier. The mood had completely changed. Every person in the room was focused on the young woman at the piano. Her fingers moved quickly across the keys, yet every note remained clear and controlled. The sound was powerful but never messy. It felt alive, as if the piano itself was speaking through her hands. The melody had reached a strong and exciting section now. The rhythm grew faster, and the notes danced across the keyboard with bright energy. A few guests exchanged amazed looks. One musician quietly whispered that the piece had become quite difficult. The speed alone required great control, but the young woman played it with calm confidence. She did not appear nervous anymore. Instead, she looked completely focused, as if she had entered a world where only the music existed. Her shoulders stayed relaxed, and her hands moved smoothly, almost effortlessly. Several listeners leaned forward in their chairs. They were no longer just curious. Now they were deeply impressed. A man standing near the window slowly crossed his arms, watching carefully. Earlier he had laughed when someone suggested the cafe worker should try playing. Now his expression showed quiet disbelief. The music suddenly changed again. The powerful rhythm softened, and a slower, emotional melody began to rise from the piano. The transition was smooth and beautiful. The young woman allowed the notes to breathe. Each tone lingered in the air for a moment before the next one arrived. The room felt peaceful. A guest sitting near the front closed their eyes for a few seconds, simply listening. Another person gently placed their hands together, resting their chin on them while watching the performance. The melody carried a deep feeling now, something thoughtful and reflective. It sounded almost like a memory. Some listeners felt a quiet warmth in their chest as the music continued. The notes seemed to tell a story without using any words. The young woman remained calm at the piano. Inside, however, she felt something powerful. She had spent so many evenings playing alone in her small room. During those nights, she often wondered what it would feel like if someone truly listened to her music. Now dozens of people were listening, and strangely, that knowledge gave her strength instead of fear. Her hands moved gently across the keys, guiding the melody forward. After a few more moments, the piece began building again. The quiet section slowly grew brighter. The rhythm returned, first softly, then with growing energy. Her fingers moved faster as the melody climbed higher. The listeners could sense that the music was heading toward something important. Several musicians in the room recognized the structure of the piece. They knew the final section was approaching, but even they were curious to see how the young woman would handle it. Because the ending required both power and control. The melody rose again with bright strength. Her left hand created a steady rhythm while her right hand moved quickly across the higher keys. The notes sparkled like light reflections on water. One guest let out a quiet breath of amazement. Another person slowly shook their head in disbelief. No one had expected this. The young woman who had walked into the room carrying drinks was now commanding the attention of every person there. The music continued building. Her fingers moved rapidly now, traveling from one end of the keyboard to the other. The sound filled the hall with excitement. The tempo increased. The rhythm became stronger. Yet her hands never lost control. Every movement looked confident and precise. The listeners sat completely still. A few people had slightly open mouths, too focused on the music to even realize it. One musician leaned closer to another and whispered that her touch on the keys was remarkable. Another nodded slowly. It was clear that she understood the instrument deeply. The performance was no longer surprising just because of who she was. It was impressive on its own. The melody climbed higher and higher, reaching the most energetic part of the piece. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with stunning speed. The notes burst forward like bright sparks of sound. Yet even in this powerful moment, the music remained clear and beautiful. Then suddenly, everything softened again. The final section had begun. Her hands slowed slightly, guiding the melody toward a peaceful ending. The powerful sounds faded into gentle notes. The hall became completely quiet except for the piano. Each note felt meaningful. Each tone seemed carefully placed. The young woman's expression stayed calm as she played the final phrases. The energy of the earlier sections slowly melted into a quiet, thoughtful mood. It felt like the closing of a long story. Several guests leaned back in their chairs, letting the music wash over them. The melody moved softly toward its last few notes. Her fingers touched the keys lightly, allowing each sound to fade naturally. No one in the room moved. No one spoke. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The young woman played the final line of the melody with gentle care. Then her fingers pressed the last chord. The sound rang clearly through the room. For a moment it echoed against the walls. Then it slowly faded into silence. Her hands rested quietly above the keys. The room stayed completely still. No one spoke. No one clapped. Not yet. The silence lasted several seconds, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when people are trying to absorb something unexpected. Many guests looked at each other, still processing what they had just heard. The young woman slowly lowered her hands into her lap. She remained seated at the piano bench, unsure of what to do next. Only a short time earlier, she had been standing quietly near the refreshment table while people joked about her trying the piano. Now the same people were staring at her with completely different expressions. The laughter from before felt like a distant memory. Something in the room had changed, and everyone knew it. Then suddenly, one person near the front of the room began clapping. The sound was strong and clear. Another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. The sound of clapping echoed through the room, louder and louder. Several guests even stood up from their chairs. The young woman looked surprised. She had not expected such a reaction. But the applause continued, growing stronger as people showed their respect. Because in that moment, everyone in the room understood something simple. They had just witnessed something remarkable. And the quiet cafe worker who had walked into the hall unnoticed had completely changed the evening. The sound of applause filled the hall, growing louder with every passing second. It echoed off the walls and seemed to carry the same feeling from everyone in the room. Pure surprise mixed with deep respect. The young woman remained seated at the piano bench for a moment, unsure of how to react. She had spent so many evenings playing music alone that she was not used to an audience responding like this. Her hands rested quietly in her lap while she looked around the room. People who had been laughing earlier were now standing and clapping. Some smiled warmly. Others shook their heads slowly, still amazed by what they had just heard. The difference in their expressions was impossible to miss. Just a short time earlier, they had seen her only as someone delivering drinks. Now they were looking at her like a true musician. After a few moments, she slowly stood up from the bench. The applause continued as she stepped slightly away from the piano. She gave a small, humble nod, not knowing what else to do. The sound of clapping finally began to soften, though the feeling of excitement in the room remained strong. One of the older musicians who had been standing near the front walked toward the piano. His expression carried both curiosity and admiration. He stopped a few steps away from her and looked at the instrument for a moment before speaking. "That was beautiful," he said calmly. His voice was not loud, but the quiet room allowed everyone to hear his words. The young woman lowered her eyes slightly and thanked him in a soft voice. The musician studied her face for a moment. It was clear that he was trying to understand how someone so quiet and unknown could perform with such skill. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The question made several people in the room lean closer. They were wondering the same thing. The young woman hesitated before answering. She was not used to speaking about herself in front of so many people. Finally, she replied honestly, She explained that she had never attended a music school. A few surprised murmurs spread through the crowd. She continued speaking quietly, explaining that she worked at the cafe across the street and often listened to the piano being played in the music hall. Over time, she had started practicing on an old keyboard at home. It was not a good instrument, she admitted. Some keys barely worked, and the sound was far from perfect. But she had practiced whenever she had the chance. Many evenings she sat alone, repeating melodies she had heard during the day. Sometimes she played the same section again and again until her fingers understood it. The room remained silent as she spoke. Several musicians exchanged thoughtful looks. They knew how difficult it was to learn music without proper training. Hearing that she had developed such skill mostly on her own made her performance even more impressive. One guest softly asked how long she had been practicing. She thought for a moment before answering. "Several years," she said simply. That answer surprised the room again. People began to realize how much dedication must have been hidden behind those quiet evenings. The older musician standing near her nodded slowly. "It shows," he said with a gentle smile. He turned slightly toward the others in the room. "Talent like this does not appear by accident," he said. Many guests nodded in agreement. Another musician stepped forward and spoke with a friendly tone. "Would you mind playing another piece someday?" he asked. The young woman looked surprised by the question. She had never imagined anyone asking her to perform again. Before she could respond, the cafe owner who had sent her to deliver refreshments stepped into the hall. He had been watching from the doorway for the last few minutes. His eyes were wide with amazement. "I had no idea," he said with a soft laugh. The young woman looked slightly embarrassed. She explained that she usually practiced late at night when the cafe was closed. The owner shook his head with a smile. "Well," he said, "I guess the cafe has been hiding a musician all this time." Several guests laughed warmly, though the laughter carried respect rather than mockery now. One of the musicians turned toward the owner and spoke thoughtfully. "If she is willing," he said, "I would be happy to help her continue learning." The room became quiet again. The young woman looked surprised. The offer had come from someone who clearly had many years of experience with music. He continued speaking kindly, explaining that talent like hers deserved proper guidance. With the right training, he believed she could grow even further as a musician. The young woman listened carefully, unsure of what to say. For a long time she had played simply because she loved music. She had never imagined the possibility of studying it seriously. But now that idea stood in front of her. The guests waited quietly for her response. Finally, she nodded gently. "I would like that," she said. A few people smiled when they heard her answer. The older musician nodded with satisfaction. "Good," he said. The atmosphere in the hall felt warm and hopeful now. People began talking again, but the tone of their voices had changed. The conversation was no longer filled with teasing jokes. Instead, many guests were discussing the performance they had just heard. Some spoke about her natural musical sense. Others admired her patience and dedication. Several people walked closer to the piano, still amazed by how such beautiful music had come from someone they had underestimated only minutes earlier. The young woman stepped away from the instrument, feeling both happy and slightly overwhelmed. She had entered the hall that evening only to deliver drinks. She had expected to return quietly to the cafe after finishing her task. Instead, the entire evening had turned into something she would remember forever. As the gathering slowly continued, a few guests approached her to thank her for the performance. They spoke kindly and asked small questions about her music. She answered politely, still surprised by all the attention. Outside the hall, the night air had grown cool and calm. Through the tall windows, the soft light from inside spilled onto the quiet street. The young woman eventually returned to the cafe, finishing her work just as she had done many evenings before. Yet something felt different now. The same small town, the same quiet streets, and the same cafe still existed. But the people who had been inside the hall would remember this night. They would remember the moment when laughter turned into silence. They would remember the quiet cafe worker who sat down at the piano and filled the room with music no one expected. And most of all, they would remember the lesson hidden inside that moment. Sometimes the greatest talent is not the one that speaks the loudest. Sometimes it is the one that waits patiently, hidden in quiet places, until the right moment arrives. And when that moment comes, it can leave everyone in awe.